I signed the papers on a Tuesday. I still loved my husband. That is the part no one tells you about. How you can watch a man dismantle 46 years of your life with the calm efficiency of someone cleaning out a storage unit and still feel the specific grief of loving him. Not the man sitting across from me in that office, pale and impatient, tapping his pen against the mahogany desk. The other one, the one from before. His name was Clifton. We met at a church picnic in Dayton, Ohio, the summer of 1978. He was 29, I was 20. He had a gap between his front teeth, and he laughed with his whole body, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. I married that laugh. I married the man who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring my mother soup when she had her first surgery, who kept a notepad on his nightstand because he said ideas came to him at 3 in the morning and he didn't want to lose them. That man and the man sitting across from me in the lawyer's office, they shared a face. That was about all. The lawyer was a woman named Ms. Peterson. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she spoke in the even, careful tone of someone who had done this particular kind of thing many times before. She slid documents across the desk and explained what I was agreeing to. Clifton didn't look at me once. He looked at his watch. He looked at the window. He looked at Ms. Peterson. He did not look at me. The house was to be transferred. Our home in Westerville, the one with the wraparound porch, the one where we raised 3 children, the one where I planted 40 rose bushes along the back fence over a period of 20 years, had already been moved into an LLC 14 months earlier. I hadn't known that. I hadn't known that at all. The house was valued at $3.9 million. I was 68 years old. I had not worked a paying job since 1986. I had managed the household, raised the children, supported his career, attended every dinner, every conference, every company retreat. I had been, in the language of the documents on that desk, a non-earning spouse. When I came home that day, my daughter was waiting in my kitchen. She was the one who had driven me to the appointment, who had sat in the car outside for 2 hours reading a novel, who had brought me coffee in a thermos because she knew I would forget to eat. Her name is Vera. She is the middle child, the one who has always watched more than she has spoken. She had her father's eyes and my stubbornness, which has always struck me as an unfair combination for everyone involved. She looked at me when I walked in, and she did not ask how it went. She just poured me a cup of coffee and set it on the counter and waited. I sat down. I said, "He signed everything over to an LLC, the house, the rental property in Columbus. The investment accounts he said he closed 5 years ago." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How long ago?" 14 months, I said. She put her hands flat on the counter. She said, "Mom, that was before he told you he wanted a divorce." "I know," I said. I had spent 8 weeks with a divorce attorney named Mr. Salter, a perfectly competent man with a corner office in Dublin, who had reviewed the documents and told me, with genuine sympathy, that the transfers appeared to have been executed legally, that the LLC had been structured in a way that, while aggressive, was not clearly fraudulent, that my options were limited. He had used the phrase "unfortunately" at this stage more than once. I had nodded at the appropriate times. I had thanked him. I had written him a check from the joint account that Clifton had not yet managed to route through an LLC. But sitting in my kitchen with Vera's hands flat on the counter and the coffee going cold in front of me, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way people describe epiphanies in movies with swelling music and sudden clarity. It was quieter than that. It was the specific feeling of having said a polite and patient goodbye to something and then deciding you were not quite finished after all. I said, "I need a different lawyer." Vera looked at me. She said, "You do. I didn't sleep much that week." I sat at the kitchen table in the hours after midnight with a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down everything I could remember. Every conversation about finance over the past 3 years. Every document I had seen or signed or been asked not to worry about. Every dinner with his business partner, a man named Roland, I had always found vaguely slick and overly careful with words, who had been deeply involved in the restructuring of what Clifton called his portfolio. I am not a lawyer. I have a degree in elementary education from Ohio State, and I spent 12 years teaching second grade before our youngest was born. But I had managed a household budget for 4 decades. I knew how to read numbers. I knew what didn't add up. The LLC had been formed in Delaware, not Ohio, where we lived. That struck me as strange. I wrote it down. The rental property transfer had been signed on a Thursday in March. I found a photograph on my phone, time-stamped that same Thursday evening, of Clifton and me at a birthday dinner for our son-in-law. Clifton was smiling in the photograph. He had ordered the salmon. He had given a toast. I wrote that down too. A friend of mine, a woman I had known since our children were in elementary school together, sharp and practical in the way that some women become after they have outlived one crisis or another, told me to call a firm in Columbus called Ashford and Wren. She said they handled high-asset divorce cases and that they had a reputation for not being intimidated. I called on a Monday morning. I made an appointment for that Thursday. The attorney who met with me was a woman I will call Ms. Ashford, because that is her name, and she has earned the use of it. She was somewhere in her late 40s, with short gray hair and the kind of focused attention that made you feel, for the first time in months, that the details actually mattered, that they were not inconvenient obstacles, but useful information. She read through what I had brought, the LLC documents, the transfer records, the timeline I had assembled on my legal pad, and she did not say "unfortunately" at this stage. She asked questions, specific questions about timing and signatures and the chain of decisions. She asked me whether Clifton had mentioned the LLC at any point before I discovered it. She asked me what I knew about Roland's role in the restructuring. Then she sat back and said, "What was done here may not be as clean as your previous attorney believed." I asked her what she meant. She said, "In Ohio, asset transfers made in anticipation of divorce, particularly when they occur within a certain window before filing, can be subject to challenge. The question is whether we can establish intent, whether we can show that the restructuring was not a routine business decision, but a deliberate move to reduce the marital estate before your husband initiated proceedings." She said, "It won't be simple." But it isn't impossible. I looked at her across the desk, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in 8 months. Not hope, exactly. Something more structural than hope. The feeling of standing on ground that might actually hold. I said, "What do I need to do?" She said, "You're going to fight him." I told Vera that evening. She cried a little, not sadly, but the way people cry when relief is too large to hold without leaking. She had been worried about me. I knew this, the way you know things your children try to hide from you, which is imperfectly but undeniably. She had been cooking extra food when she visited and leaving it in my refrigerator. She had been calling every other day and asking how I was sleeping in a voice designed to sound casual. She had been, without either of us naming it, keeping watch. She said, "Good." She said, "It's about time." My son was a different matter. He had been on his father's side since the beginning, not cruelly, but with the particular loyalty of a child who has always identified more strongly with one parent, who had built his sense of himself partly in relation to his father's approval. He called me the week after my appointment with Ms. Ashford. He said that he had heard I was pursuing litigation. He said, in a tone that tried to be gentle and wasn't quite, that maybe it was time to let things go, that it would be better for everyone if we could settle this quietly. He said, "Dad is 69 years old, Mom. This could drag on for years." I said, "I know how old your father is." He said, I just want you to think about what this does to the family." I did not say what I wanted to say, which was that his father might have considered the family somewhat earlier in this process. I said that I appreciated his concern. I said I would think about it. I did not tell him what I had decided. The litigation took 11 months. I will not detail every step of it here, because the truth is that most of litigation is tedious. It is documents and depositions, and waiting and amended filings and more waiting. And the dramatic version of it that exists in people's imaginations does not resemble the actual experience, which involves a lot of time in conference rooms eating bad coffee and trying to follow conversations about jurisdictional precedents. What I will tell you is what Ms. Ashford found. The LLC had been established not 14 months before the divorce filing, as I had initially understood, but 22 months before. However, and this was the detail that changed everything, Roland had submitted an invoice for restructuring services that was dated 4 months earlier than the LLC formation documents. That invoice referenced, in the dry, bureaucratic language of financial services, anticipated dissolution of personal holdings. Not business restructuring. Dissolution of personal holdings. Clifton's attorney argued it was standard language. Ms. Ashford argued it was evidence of intent. There were also emails. Clifton had used his personal email for some of the early communications with Roland, which was a significant oversight for a man who had otherwise been quite careful. The emails, once subpoenaed, showed a conversation that began not with business strategy but with a question. What's the fastest way to get the house out of reach? The answer Roland had provided was the LLC. The judge in our case was a man of few words who had, by all accounts, seen a great many things in 30 years on the domestic relations bench. He found that the transfers had been made in anticipation of divorce and that they constituted fraudulent dissipation of marital assets. He ordered the LLC assets to be included in the marital estate for purposes of division. He also ordered Clifton to pay a portion of my legal fees. I sat in the courtroom when the ruling was read, and I felt, not triumph. I want to be honest about this. I felt the particular exhaustion of having held something very heavy for a very long time and been told you could finally set it down. I felt the strangeness of a victory that costs so much that it doesn't feel clean. I thought about the man with the gap-toothed laugh and the notepad on the nightstand, and I felt, not for the first time, the specific sadness of grieving someone who is still alive. My son called that evening. He said he didn't know what to say. I told him he didn't need to say anything. I meant that kindly, and I think he heard it that way. Vera was in the courtroom with me. She had taken the day off work. When it was over, she took my hand in the hallway outside and we walked out into the October afternoon together, and she said, "You okay?" I said, "I will be." That was true. The house sold 8 months later, after the required process of appraisal and buyout negotiations, and finally a listing. I received my share. It was enough to buy a smaller place outright. A house in a neighborhood in Bexley with a yard that is nothing like what I had. But that is mine in a way the other house stopped being, somewhere in those 14 months before I knew to be angry. Clifton moved into a condominium on the other side of Columbus. I heard from Vera, not as a report but incidentally, the way news filters through when families remain tangled in proximity, that he had begun seeing someone, that he seemed diminished somehow. Quieter, I do not wish him harm. I want to be precise about that. I spent too many years with him to reduce the whole of it to the worst of it, but I no longer organize my life around the question of what he is feeling. That is new. It took a long time. There is a rose bush in the yard of the house in Bexley. Just one, for now. A pale peach variety that I planted the first spring I was there, on a Saturday in April when the ground was just soft enough. My neighbor came over the fence to ask about it, and we talked for 45 minutes about soil composition. And I realized, standing there in my garden gloves with the afternoon going golden around the edges, that I had not had an unguarded conversation with someone new in years, that I had contracted, without fully noticing, into a very small space. I am still expanding back out. Vera calls on Sunday mornings now. We have made it a habit, the way you make habits when you realize that the things you love require some deliberate tending, or they go quiet. She asks about the rose. She asks about the neighbor. She asks how I'm sleeping, still but differently now, not watching for cracks, but just asking, the way people ask when they want to know the ordinary texture of your days. I tell her I sleep well. Most nights that is even true. I am not the woman who sat across from Peterson's mahogany desk and watched a man count the minutes until he could leave. I am not the woman who drove home that day unsure if the ground would hold. I am 69 years old and I live in a house with one rosebush and a neighbor who knows more about drainage and nitrogen levels than anyone I have met in decades, and I chose, when it mattered, to stay on the field. That is the part I want you to hear. If you are sitting somewhere in a situation that looks from the outside like it's already settled, it is not always settled. Sometimes the ground shifts. Sometimes you find an invoice with the wrong date and an email with the right question, and a lawyer who says it isn't impossible, and the whole calculus changes. You have to be willing to ask what was actually done, and whether it was actually legal, and what you would need precisely to find out, I asked. It turned out to matter very much that I did.